This episode is brought to you by HASA. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the bottom feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about a saltwater pool versus a chlorine pool. And I'm going to cover the age-old debate, is a saltwater pool better? And I'll cover it based on different categories. And then you can decide from there how you want to go forward with your pool setup or with the customers on your route if you want to start selling more salt systems or just sticking with the chlorine. Are you a pool service pro looking to take your business to the next level? Join the Pool Guy Coaching Program. Get expert advice, business tips, exclusive content, and get direct support from me. I'm a 35-year veteran in the industry. Whether you're starting out or scaling up, I've got the tools to help you succeed. Learn more at swimmingpoollearning.com. Of course, you may want to let your customers know that a saltwater pool is still a chlorine pool. It's just adding the chlorine for you or for them. You know, it has salt, then electrolysis, then chlorine gas, and then it dissolves back in the water if you want to keep it simple. And that's kind of how it produces the chlorine. So it is a myth that it's a chlorine-free pool. Although a lot of people still believe this myth. I hear it all the time, like, oh, I have a salt pool, so I'm not using chlorine. Or the salespeople at the store may sell them a salt system, letting them think that it's not actually adding chlorine to the pool, but it is actually making chlorine. Now, let me give you the basic pros of each right now so you can kind of get an idea of what you want to do with your pool care and the pools on your route. The pros for the salt system is that it's going to be adding chlorine to the pool on a pretty much continuous basis, barring any kind of problems with the salt system or the salt cell getting dirty or not having enough salt in the water. So there are some parameters that you're working with a saltwater pool. It's not set it and forget it, as some salespeople may tell the customer. There are things you have to do. Keep the salt cell clean, make sure the control panel is operating, make sure there's a certain amount of salt in the water for that system, and also making sure that the output is set, the pump is running at the right time so that it produces enough chlorine while the salt water system is generating. It sounds complicated, but it's really easy. It'll take you about a week or two to get everything fine-tuned and dialed in. And then you have to keep an eye on the salt system again to make sure the salt cell doesn't get any kind of calcium buildup, which will stop the production. The salt level may drop in the pool. You have to add some salt to make sure that it can still produce. And there are some malfunctions that happen once in a while with the saltwater system. But in general, it's a pretty simple and easy way to add chlorine to the pool continuously. And that's one of the main benefits of the saltwater system. You'll find that the pools with these operational on your pool route have a lot less algae problems, and they have a lot less instances where the chlorine actually zeroes out in the pool. So for me, I think they're a great benefit if everything is working, of course, and it's producing chlorine as it is supposed to be producing chlorine. The benefit of a chlorine pool is pretty simple as well, because there's not a lot of high upfront costs with a chlorine pool. And I'll touch on the cost of the salt system later as a negative. But as far as chlorine, maybe you're buying a bucket of tablets, so that's $180 or $200 for a 15-pound bucket of trichlor tablets. And then you're buying liquid chlorine or cal hypo during the course of the whole season. And I'll just peg this number. I'll keep it simple and say you're spending $400 each season to chlorinate your pool. Not a huge amount of money, and something that's pretty much the average, I would say, as far as costs go. Maybe depending on how big your pool is, the price goes up. But I would say $400 is a realistic number on chlorine costs. And then you have the cost of muriatic acid as well, and cost of anything else that you want to put in the pool. But as far as just comparing chlorine costs between the saltwater generator and a chlorine pool, initially there's not a lot of money upfront for the chlorine pool, unlike the saltwater generator. So for me, that's definitely something that is a benefit for the chlorine pool. And it's relatively easy to add the chlorine to the pool on a regular basis if you have trichlor tablets in a floater or a feeder, and then you're supplementing that with cal hypo or liquid chlorine. It's not a very difficult process to add chlorine to the pool each week. It's not as simple as the saltwater generator, but it's also not rocket science on the other end of it. Now, if you're doing straight math here versus, realistic math, I'm just going to use straight math here because it's something that gives you an idea of the correlation between the saltwater system and a chlorine pool, because it all varies and every pool is different. Every salt system is different. For instance, you may get a salt system put in for 2,000 and a replacement cell may be 1,000, but there are replacement cells that are only 500, like the True Clear, and the Pentair cells like the IC40 is somewhere around $1,200 to replace. So that's variables that are hard to control or calculate for in realistic, real-life situations. So let's just say you spend $400 a year on chlorine, and you get a salt cell installed for $2,000, and a replacement cell is $1,000 as well. So that's a total of $3,000. And let's just give yourself 8 years, because 4 years with the original cell, and then 4 years with the replacement cell. And you divide that by 8, 3,000 divided by 8, and that's a cost of about $375 over that every year over that 8-year period. Again, this is just fake math, but it gives you an idea of some mathematical correlation between chlorine and salt. So $3,000 over 8 years is $375. If you, of course, spent $400 a year, and over 8 years, 400 times 8, that would be $3,200. So that particular salt system actually saves you a little bit of money. Now, I wouldn't say in the real world that's negligible, because some salt systems, of course, the cells cost more. Sometimes you get away with a lot less chlorine in pools, but you get an idea that mathematically they're not really far apart, although the salt system, I think in reality, does cost more upfront costs plus the maintenance costs and then adding salt to the water. There's other factors that kind of add to the cost that I didn't calculate here, especially if you have pool service they charge for salt cell cleaning, and you have to factor that in. And again, factor in the cost of adding salt to the pool, which I think is not a huge amount of money, but that is a factor. In some areas, you have to add more salt during the season or the following season based on how much rain you get in the pool. So again, realistically, a saltwater pool is still going to cost more, in my opinion, than a chlorine pool, but it's not a disparity that's like, between a Mercedes SUV and then maybe like a Toyota, RAV4 or something. It's not that big of a disparity in cost. It's going to cost more, I think, and it's a factor, and it is a con of the salt system to have the upfront cost and then the recurring cost of replacing a salt cell. And the Pool Guy Podcast Show has teamed up with UPA to bring you affordable, reliable liability insurance starting at just $64 a month. Get up to $2 million in coverage, and the members of my coaching group get an even lower rate. Protect your business and your peace of mind. Sign up with UPA today by clicking the link in the podcast description. Where in a chlorine pool, you don't really have a recurring cost except maybe the trichlor tablets every year or every 2 years to purchase. And again, if you're comparing it just across the board like that, you can get a better idea with a closer analysis using real math with your pool. How much money you spend on chlorine every year in your pool, add up all your receipts, how much will the salt system cost, how long is the salt cell rated for, how long is the lifespan, and you can get a more realistic correlation. So I would say that it is a con still that the salt system has such a high upfront cost, and then it has the cost of the salt cell. There's also a little bit of a corrosion issue with the saltwater pool. I don't think it's something that would stop me from having a saltwater pool. I've had a saltwater pool for a long time myself, but you should factor that in, especially if the salt water or the salt level gets to 4,500 parts per million or 5,000 parts per million. You're definitely going to see some corrosion of heater parts. Most decks are impervious to salt at that level, but there are a few surface types that maybe a soft surface coping type would be susceptible to high level of salt. If you keep it at the regular level, corrosion is not a major issue. And it used to be that you had to have a certain amount of PVC pipe in the equipment to prevent corrosion if you had copper piping, but I think most people don't have copper piping any longer. And there's some cautions with like metal lined above ground pools, that could cause some corrosion. But other than that, I don't think the corrosive nature is something to really focus on as a major negative. Most pools can have a saltwater system with really no issues at all. I think the negative on the chlorine would be the chemical smell of the chlorine in some cases, and the fact that you have to add it manually to the pool. Although it's not difficult to do, you are having to add the chlorine each week, which of course the saltwater generator takes that out of the equation. And the chemical smell of the trichlor tablets can be an issue for some customers, especially leaving a 50-pound bucket back there. They may not like having that in their backyard. I understand that some customers don't want the bucket back there. Most pool services in my area, including myself, sell the customer the 50-pound bucket of tablet at our cost or a little bit of a markup. Then we leave it at the account. So having the chemicals back there is somewhat of a drawback with the chlorine pool. Having a bucket of cal hypo, having some trichlor tablets back there is something to consider. And a saltwater system is much cleaner. You just have maybe 1 or 2 bags of salt in the equipment area, and then you have the saltwater generator working. So cleaner for sure. And I would say storing the chemicals and the chemical smell is definitely a con for the chlorine pool. But again, nothing that's going to make me run out there and purchase a saltwater system, nor is it going to really move the needle too much for most customers. Telling your customer that you won't have to worry about the trichlor tablets or having chlorine stored here. I don't think I've sold a system just by doing that. You have to really preach the benefits of the convenience and of the saltwater generator producing the chlorine and making the pool much more swim ready and eliminating chances of algae and things like that. All of that kind of goes into your sell sheet to the customer. There's some talk when you're selling these at the pool store of the water being softer. I can see that would be something that you would want to promote. Since you're salting the water, I suppose the water would be a little bit softer. I don't think, again, you should be using that as your main selling point for the customer. And I think a lot of times when people think about being irritated by chlorine, like their eyes burning and things of that nature, it's really not the chlorine in the pool, but the pH got too low, causing your skin to get irritated, maybe a rash, and having itchy eyes. That gets blamed on chlorine a lot, and in a lot of cases, that's because the pH is too low in the pool while they're using it, or there's chloramines forming because the chlorine is becoming ineffective, and a lot of organics is getting mixed in there, making the chlorine less effective and adding chloramines to the water, causing the burning, itchy eyes. With a saltwater pool, I'm pretty sure you're going to reduce the effect of chloramines because the chlorine will always be being produced by the saltwater system. It'll be injected into the pool all week long or every day during the week. And so the chances of you having the pool zero out or having irritation from having chloramines is a lot lower in a saltwater pool in most cases, in my experience, than in the chlorine pool, where you may have to add chlorine or shock the pool. You're not shocking the pool nearly as much with a saltwater generator because it's always producing a constant level of chlorine in the pool. And you really can't shock a saltwater pool at the control panel. Now, I know a lot of them have a superchlorinate button or a max chlorinate button or something like that. Really all it does is it changes the output. If you had to set it 50%, it changes to 100% output. And that's kind of how the salt system superchlorinates. Will you need to add chlorine to a saltwater pool? Well, in some cases, yes. When you have a party and you want to chlorinate the pool afterwards because the pool looks cloudy, hitting superchlorinate on the saltwater generator may not do the trick. So adding a gallon of liquid chlorine is sometimes needed. Sometimes you have to shock the pool when the chlorine generator fails. I mentioned some fail points. Maybe the salt level gets too low in the pool, causing the generator not to produce chlorine. Maybe the salt cell gets calcium buildup, not letting the salt system produce chlorine. And in those cases, if the chlorine gets to zero or gets really low, you will have to shock a saltwater pool in those instances. So having a saltwater pool doesn't mean that you're never going to use chlorine again. It just means that it should be adding chlorine to a specific level each day, let's say 5 parts per million, and you should not have to supplement that with chlorine only under certain circumstances. So I'm not saying the saltwater pool, you'll never have to use chlorine again, and that's kind of a myth as well. You may still need to chlorinate your pool with some liquid chlorine, or you may also need to put a trichlor tablet in the pool in the wintertime, because one of the major drawbacks of a saltwater pool, in my opinion, this is a drawback based on the nature of how it operates. You can't fix it. So it's not like a defect. In water, usually in the 60 degrees or below, the saltwater system is not going to really work because electricity doesn't really conduct well in cold water. So the system is going to turn itself off. You're going to need to supplement the pool in the wintertime here in California with either a trichlor tablet and a floater, which I like because then it adds some cyanuric acid into the water. And that's something that I think is useful. You don't have to add cyanuric acid during the season. If you have maybe 1 tablet a month in the floater in the wintertime, you can supplement with liquid chlorine or cal hypo. If you have a long season and you want to keep using your pool and heat the pool, the salt system will activate again when the water reaches a certain temperature. So don't worry about that. But in a lot of cases, if you're not using your pool and the water is in the 60s and the 50s, you will need to supplement that with chlorine, basically, if you have a saltwater generator. I don't think it's a big deal, but it's something that you should keep in mind when you have a saltwater pool, that it's not going to be running all year round. And so therefore, you're going to have to rely on chlorine as well. And then I think the last benefit, and this is a pretty big benefit in my opinion, and this is something that's really not talked a lot when they're selling you the saltwater system, but there is an element that goes into the pool, and we talk about it a lot in the industry. It's called cyanuric acid. CYA is what we use all the time when we're talking about it. This is a chemical that you add to the pool to help protect the chlorine level in the pool. However, this can get out of hand very rapidly, and the higher the cyanuric acid level, the more chlorine you're going to need to add to the pool to make the pool safe to swim in. Now there's a basic formula. I'll go over it with you here real quick. And the chlorine is effective based on a 7.5% calculation. So if your cyanuric acid level is 120 parts per million, you times that by 7.5%, and you're going to need to have 9 parts per million of free chlorine in the pool to make it effective. That's a lot of chlorine, and that's a lot of chlorine product. If the cyanuric acid is at 70 parts per million times 7.5%, you just need to have 5 parts per million of free chlorine in the pool. So one of the benefits of a saltwater generator is that it makes the chlorine without adding cyanuric acid to the water. How is this a benefit? Well, if you're using trichlor tablets, which is the largest chlorine that's sold, or the most popular chlorine that's sold, the largest percentage of chlorine used in backyard pools, that adds cyanuric acid to the pool to a level that is pretty astronomical in some cases, because half the weight of the trichlor tablets is cyanuric acid. So if you use a whole 50-pound bucket in one season, you're adding 25 pounds of cyanuric acid to the water, which in most cases raises the cyanuric acid level above 150, 180, 200 parts per million, making the chlorine less effective. So the saltwater generator will allow you to regulate the cyanuric acid level a lot easier because it's not adding it. Of course, you can do this with liquid chlorine and cal hypo as well. It just doesn't have the lasting effect of the cyanuric acid, of the saltwater generator producing chlorine, I should say. And this is a better way to control cyanuric acid in pools, in my opinion, having a saltwater generator, and then you're adding the cyanuric acid manually by adding some cyanuric acid to the pool itself, or with a trichlor tablet in the wintertime, slowly dissolving it, releasing cyanuric acid. So I think that's a big benefit of saltwater pools, is that you don't have to worry about runaway cyanuric acid in most cases because you have more control over it. And you're not using a chlorine type that has cyanuric acid in it, which would raise the cyanuric acid in the pool. So less draining of the water. Really, it's going to be a better way to take care of your pool without having to worry about adding more and more chlorine to the pool to counter the high cyanuric acid. To me, that's a true benefit of a saltwater pool. And we don't talk about it much, and it's complicated to talk about it. I mean, if a salesman's telling you this at the counter, you would just look like a deer in the headlights at that point, not knowing the science behind it. But I really think it's up to you to choose if you want a saltwater generator or stick with a chlorine pool. Real math, I think, shows that a saltwater generator is more expensive to operate over chlorine. And also, there are some side benefits to the saltwater generator that we don't talk about too much, like I mentioned here at the end. But I wouldn't hesitate to sell saltwater generators to my customers. I wouldn't hesitate to recommend you get a saltwater generator for your pool. I think just the convenience factor of always having a good chlorine level is enough for me, and it's really enough for a lot of people as well. There's really not a lot of upselling you can do with the salt system because I've mentioned all the cons here and the upfront costs and everything. It's just going to be the convenience factor. It's going to be the biggest selling point, in my opinion, for a saltwater generator over a standard chlorine pool. Looking for other podcasts? I put one here on YouTube every Monday through Friday. Also go to my website, swimmingpoollearning.com. Click on the podcast icon on the banner. There'll be a drop-down menu there for you as well for podcast episodes. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.